Welcome to the shadows of the Golden Age. Obsession often wears the mask of passion. For one Hollywood legend, that mistake became a prison sentence. Ingrid Bergman survived the war, but she barely survived the love of Roberto Rossellini. After Casablanca, she was a queen. Meeting Rossellini, she became a possession. Driven by a sickening jealousy, this director clipped his wife's wings, forbidding her to fly with anyone else. He mined her talent until it was dry, dragging her to the bottom of a career abyss where a legend was nearly buried forever under the tomb of a male ego. In 1948, Ingrid Bergman was Hollywood's saint, a wholesome brand manufactured by the studio system to be the Palmolive Garbo. But behind the mansion walls, she was suffocating. Her husband, Dr. Peter Lindstrom, was the architect of her cage. He managed her life with the cold precision of a neurosurgeon, timing her schedule with a stopwatch and weighing her like a biological asset. She was living in a sterile laboratory, safe but starving for chaos. That chaos arrived when she watched Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City. The film's raw, gritty truth was a shock to her system, a violent contrast to her artificial Hollywood existence. In that dark theater, witnessing a cinema that bled reality, she decided that this Italian director held the key to her prison cell. She went home and wrote the letter that would detonate her life. It was a short note, playful and humble. Dear Mr. Rossellini, I saw your films Open City and Paisan and enjoyed them very much. If you need a Swedish actress who speaks English very well, who has not forgotten her German, who is not very understandable in French, and who in Italian knows only ti amo, I am ready to come and make a film with you. She thought she was applying for a job. She thought she was seeking an artistic collaboration. In reality, she was handing him the weapon he would use to control her. Roberto Rossellini received the letter in Rome. At that moment, his career was stalling. He was a man of immense chaotic energy, a gambler, a womanizer, and a self-proclaimed genius who viewed Hollywood with a mixture of burning envy and sneering contempt. He hated the commercialism of American cinema, yet he was desperate for funding. When he held the letter from Ingrid Bergman, he didn't just see an actress, he saw leverage. He saw the ultimate trophy. To steal the Queen of Hollywood away from the factory and bring her into his world of pure art would be the greatest victory of his life. It would validate his superiority over the studio system he claimed to despise. He didn't write back offering a role. He wrote back offering a crusade. He flew to Paris to meet her at the Hotel George V. The contrast between them was stark. Ingrid was poised, elegant, nervous, representing millions of dollars in box office potential. Rossellini was disheveled, passionate, speaking in broken English, waving his hands, talking about souls and truth and the death of cinema. He told her that Hollywood was destroying her. He told her she was a great tree being choked by ivy. He looked at her not as a star, but as a woman who needed saving. For Ingrid, starved of passion and sick of perfection, this messy, intense Italian man was a drug. He offered her the one thing Hollywood refused to give her, the permission to be flawed. He pitched her a film concept that didn't even have a script. It was just an idea about a woman in a refugee camp who marries a fisherman to escape, only to find herself trapped on a volcanic island. It was Stromboli. But the film was secondary. The seduction was primary. Rossellini wasn't just directing a movie. He was directing a life change. He convinced her that her husband, the dentist, was a bore who stifled her spirit. He convinced her that her duty was to art, not to societal expectations. When Ingrid flew to Rome in 1949, she told herself it was just for work. She told her husband she would be back in a few months. She told the press it was an artistic sabbatical. But from the moment her foot touched Italian soil, the trap snapped shut. Rossellini was waiting. He didn't just greet her, he claimed her. He drove her through Italy like a conquering hero, showing off his spoils. The affair began almost immediately. It was fueled by the adrenaline of the forbidden and the intoxicating clash of their cultures. He was volatile and chaotic. She was composed but desperate to break her own mold. Then, the news broke. In the conservative climate of 1950, the scandal didn't just make headlines, it detonated. It wasn't just a tabloid rumor, it was a moral crisis that shook the Western world. When it was revealed that Ingrid was pregnant with Rossellini's child while still married to Lindstrom, the saint didn't just fall from the pedestal. She was dragged through the mud. The reaction in America was hysterical and violent. This wasn't just an actress having an affair. This was a betrayal of the national narrative. They had bought tickets to see a virtuous woman, and she had sold them a lie. The hate mail arrived by the truckload. People wrote that she was a whore, a degenerate, a danger to American values. Ed Sullivan asked his audience to vote on whether she should be allowed back on television. But the ultimate blow came from the government. Senator Edwin C. Johnson took the floor of the United States Senate to denounce her. He called her a powerful influence for evil. He called her Hollywood's apostle of degradation. He proposed a bill to license actresses and actors based on their moral character, specifically to prevent people like Bergman from corrupting the youth. The psychological weight was crushing. The government of the most powerful country on earth was effectively legislating against her existence. She was stripped of her reputation overnight. Her films were boycotted, religious groups picketed theaters. She was effectively exiled. She couldn't go back to America even if she wanted to. The hostility was too physical, too dangerous. At this exact moment, the mechanism of Rossellini's control began to grind into gear. The scandal did not push them apart. It welded them together. Rossellini used the world's hatred as mortar to build a wall around her. He spun the narrative. Look at them, he would say. Look how hypocritical they are. They hate us because we are free. They hate us because we are real. I am the only one who accepts you. I am the only one who loves the real Ingrid, not the fake saint they created. He weaponized her isolation. In Hollywood, she had agents, publicists, friends, and a husband who managed her affairs. In Italy, surrounded by a language she barely spoke, amidst a culture that was chaotic and foreign, she had only Roberto. He became her translator, her protector, her director, and her jailer. He intercepted her mail to shield her from the hate, but in doing so, he also filtered out any lifelines. He controlled the information flow. He made himself the sole filter through which she experienced reality. The isolation was total. She had left her daughter Pia behind in America, and the guilt was eating her alive. Rossellini used that guilt too. He convinced her that the only way to justify the pain she had caused was to create great art with him. If they failed, the sacrifice was in vain. If they succeeded, it was redemption. He raised the stakes until every day felt like a matter of life and death. But the art he promised was not the liberation she had imagined. As they prepared to shoot Stromboli, Ingrid began to realize that escaping the gilded cage of Hollywood didn't mean she was free. It just meant she had traded a cage of gold for a cage of rock and fire. The man who had seduced her with promises of reality was about to introduce her to a reality so harsh, so controlling, and so professionally suicidal that she would eventually look back on the boredom of Beverly Hills with desperate longing. The scandal had burned the bridge behind her. There was no going back. She was alone on an island with a man who viewed her not as a partner, but as a possession. The embargo had begun not with a contract, but with a ring of fire. The fire of the scandal eventually burned down to embers, but what rose from the ashes was not freedom. It was a cold, iron wall of silence. The public trial was over, but the private imprisonment was just beginning, and the warden held the keys tightly in a fist of jealousy. The professional blockade was absolute. Rossellini viewed the scripts arriving from Los Angeles not as opportunities, but as insults. To him, offers from directors like Alfred Hitchcock or George Cukor were attempts by the factory to reclaim his prize. He established a rule that was non-negotiable. Ingrid Bergman works for Roberto Rossellini, and only for Roberto Rossellini. He announced this to the press with the arrogance of a king annexing a new territory. "I am the only one who knows how to photograph her," he declared. "I am the only one who understands her truth." It was a breathtaking display of narcissism. He was effectively telling directors like Alfred Hitchcock, George Cukor, and Leo McCarey, men who had guided Bergman to Oscar nominations and global adoration, that they were incompetent butchers who had merely exploited her pretty face. He, Rossellini, was the only artist capable of revealing her soul. The tragedy was that Hollywood did not give up on her immediately. Despite the scandal, despite the Senate denunciations, the studio heads were pragmatists. They knew that scandal sold tickets. They knew that if Ingrid Bergman returned to the screen in a high-gloss, big-budget melodrama, the American public would forgive her in a heartbeat. They sent offers. They sent telegrams. They sent scripts tailored to her strengths, roles that would have restored her image and her bank account. Ingrid never saw them. Rossellini intercepted the mail. He became the gatekeeper of her reality. When a script arrived, he would read it, sneer at its commercial structure, and bury it. Or, in a display of calculated dominance, he would reply on her behalf. He wrote letters to major producers declining their offers with a haughtiness that ensured they would never write again. He burned bridges that she didn't even know existed. He told her that Hollywood had turned its back on her, that she was a pariah, that the Americans hated her and would never accept her again. He fed her a steady diet of despair, painting a picture of a world where she had no options left but him. "They don't understand you," he would say. "They only want the plastic saint. I love the woman." It was a masterclass in isolation. He made himself the only lifeboat in an ocean of hostility that he helped manufacture. But the true torture was not what he kept from her. It was what he forced her to do. The production of Stromboli in 1949 was the first laboratory for his experiment in deglamorization. He took a woman who was used to the air-conditioned trailers and catering trucks of MGM and dragged her to a literal volcano. The island of Stromboli was primitive. There were no hotels, no electricity, no running water. The locals were suspicious and hostile, muttering about the whore who had come to their island. The ground shook with tremors from the active volcano. The air smelled of sulfur and rot. For Ingrid, the physical hardships were manageable. She was tough. The psychological dismantling was what nearly broke her. She arrived on set expecting to work. She was a professional. She wanted to see the script. She wanted to know her lines. She wanted to discuss the character's motivation. In Hollywood, preparation was the armor an actor wore to feel safe. Rossellini gave her nothing. There was no script. He worked on instinct, on chaos. He would wake up in the morning, look at the sky, look at the volcano, and decide what to shoot. He would scribble dialogue on a napkin 5 minutes before the cameras rolled. Sometimes he would give her no dialogue at all. He would simply tell her to walk from point A to point B and look sad. His direction stripped her of her intellect. On the volcanic slopes of Stromboli, amidst the sulfur fumes and the rats that infested their primitive lodgings, he would bark commands that reduced her to an animal. "Walk there, look scared," he would scream. When Ingrid, desperate for context, would ask, "Why? What is the character thinking? What is her motivation?" Rossellini would explode. "You Hollywood robot!" he would roar in front of the entire crew. "You don't need to think. I am the one who thinks. You are just a body. React." He was actively dismantling her greatest asset, her mind. He wanted a puppet that bled, not an artist who collaborated. When she asked with rising panic, "Why am I sad? What has just happened? What am I thinking about?" he would explode. He would scream at her in Italian, a language she barely understood, calling her a Hollywood robot. He treated her questions not as valid professional inquiries, but as evidence of her corruption. He humiliated her in front of the crew, mocking her need for structure as a weakness. He was stripping her of her tools. By denying her a script, he denied her the ability to build a character. He forced her to exist in a state of constant, anxious improvisation. She was never acting. She was simply reacting to his confusion. The terror you see in her eyes in Stromboli is not the terror of the character Karen. It is the terror of Ingrid Bergman, wondering if her career is ending, wondering if she has made a catastrophic mistake, wondering why the man who claimed to love her is treating her like a prop. And then there was the camera. In the hands of Hollywood cinematographers like Greg Toland or Joseph Ruttenberg, the camera was a lover. It caressed Ingrid's face. It used soft focus, backlighting, and careful angles to turn her into an ethereal being. Rossellini's camera was an autopsy instrument. He rejected makeup. He forbade the hairdresser from styling her hair. He wanted her sweat. He wanted her pores. He wanted the dirt under her fingernails. In Notorious, Alfred Hitchcock had used soft focus and shadow to turn her into an enigma, a goddess wrapped in mystery. Rossellini did the opposite. He employed a brutal reverse Pygmalion effect. Instead of sculpting a statue into a woman, he was trying to smash a goddess back into raw clay. He used flat, harsh lighting that mercilessly exposed every pore, every sunspot, every line of exhaustion. And he used this imagery to deploy a vicious psychological weapon: ageism. Ingrid was approaching 40, a dangerous age for an actress in the 1950s. Rossellini preyed on this insecurity. He whispered that Hollywood only wanted fresh meat, that the studios would reject her aging face. He convinced her that he, and only he, with his obsession for truth, was capable of loving her wrinkles. By making her look old on camera, he wasn't just pursuing realism. He was destroying her market value to ensure she had nowhere else to go. If Pygmalion fell in love with his creation and brought it to life, Rossellini was the anti-Pygmalion. He found a living goddess and tried to turn her into clay. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in capturing her at her worst. If she looked tired, he shot a close-up. If her eyes were puffy from crying over his shouting, he rolled the camera. He viewed her beauty not as an asset, but as an obstacle to the truth. He wanted to prove that he could take the most glamorous woman in the world and make her look like a peasant. It was a visual assertion of ownership. He was effectively saying, "The world owns the image of the saint. I own the reality of the flesh, and I will show you how heavy that flesh is." When Stromboli was finally released in 1950, the result was catastrophic. The film was a jagged, difficult, depressing piece of neorealism that baffled audiences. In America, RKO Studios, angry at the scandal and the lack of commercial viability, butchered the edit, turning it into a disjointed mess. But even in its pure form, the film was a rejection of everything the audience loved about Ingrid Bergman. They went to the theater to see a star. They saw a tired, confused woman wandering around a desolate rock. The box office numbers were abysmal. The critics were savage. They didn't just dislike the movie, they took personal offense at it. They saw it as Rossellini vandalizing a national treasure. The failure of Stromboli should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it tightened the noose. Rossellini used the failure to reinforce his narrative. "See," he told her, "they are Philistines. They don't appreciate art. We are martyrs." He framed their professional failure as a romantic struggle against a stupid world. And because the film had flopped, no other offers came, or at least that's what he told her. The truth was that the box office poison label was beginning to stick, but it was Rossellini who was applying the glue. He moved her into the next project, Europa 51. The pattern repeated, but with darker undertones. In this film, he cast her as a wealthy woman who goes mad with guilt and grief, eventually being committed to an asylum. The psychological cruelty of the role was hard to ignore. He was directing his wife to play a woman losing her mind, while in real life, he was driving her to the edge of sanity. On set, the atmosphere was suffocating. Rossellini was becoming increasingly erratic, obsessed with his own genius and dismissive of her input. He would shoot scenes in the middle of chaotic Rome streets, with passers-by staring at the fallen star. Ingrid felt exposed, vulnerable, and amateurish. She began to doubt her own talent. This was the ultimate victory of Rossellini's gaslighting. For a decade, critics had told her she was the greatest actress since Deuce. Now, she looked in the mirror and saw a fraud. She believed Rossellini when he told her she was nothing without him. She believed that her Hollywood success had been a trick of the light, and that this misery, this confusion, this silence was the only reality she deserved. The embargo extended beyond the screen. He controlled her social life. He kept her away from English-speaking friends who might talk sense into her. He surrounded her with his sycophants, people who owed their careers to him and would never dare question the maestro. When old friends from Hollywood visited Rome and tried to see her, Rossellini would intervene. He would make excuses. He would create scenes. Or he would sit in on the meetings, looming over the conversation, speaking for her, translating her thoughts, ensuring that she never had a moment of unsupervised contact with her past life. He was terrified that someone would break the spell. He was terrified that someone would say, "Ingrid, you are the biggest star in the world. Why are you letting this man ruin you?" By 1952, the cracks in the foundation were becoming canyons. While Ingrid remained faithful to their artistic pact, Rossellini began to stray. The final insult of the embargo was that while he demanded absolute fidelity from her, fidelity to him, fidelity to his art, he felt no such obligation. He was a force of nature who refused to be contained. He began to chase new muses, leaving her alone in the apartment with their children, Isotta, Isabella, and Roberto Jr. She sat there, the woman who had given up the world for him, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. But she couldn't leave. The trap was too well constructed. She had burned her bridges with America. She was vilified by the church and the state. She had 3 Italian children who Rossellini, and Italian law, would never let her take out of the country. And perhaps most tragically, She still believed in the myth he had spun. She believed that suffering was the price of art. She believed that her misery was proof of her depth. She was a hostage suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, falling in love with the specific architecture of her cell because she had been told that the world outside was on fire. The nadir came with Joan of Arc at the stake, 1954. It was a filmed version of a stage oratorio. It was static, boring, and pretentious. It was the antithesis of cinema. When it was released, it wasn't just hated, it was ignored. The world had stopped caring about the scandal. They had simply moved on. A new generation of stars, Audrey Hepburn, Marilyn Monroe, Grace Kelly, had risen to take her place. Ingrid Bergman was becoming a footnote, a trivia question. Whatever happened to the girl from Casablanca? Rossellini had succeeded. He had taken the most luminous star in the galaxy and turned her into a black hole. He had proved his point. He had proved that he could possess her so completely that she ceased to exist for anyone else. But he had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten that Ingrid Bergman was not actually a peasant. She was not actually a madwoman. She was an actress. And deep down, buried under layers of guilt and manipulation, the professional survival instinct that had carried her from Stockholm to Hollywood was not dead. It was just waiting for a script. And that script was about to arrive not from him, but from the very place he despised the most. The cracks in the prison wall were microscopic, but they were there. The debt was mounting. The creditors were knocking. Rossellini's arrogance was becoming tiresome, even to his own entourage. And Ingrid was starting to look at her husband not as a god, but as a man who was failing. The embargo had held for 5 years, but no blockade lasts forever when the people inside are starving. The hunger for dignity, for competence, and for the simple joy of doing a job well was beginning to gnaw at her. The saint was dead, yes, but the fighter was waking up. But waking up is dangerous when you realize the bed you are sleeping in is owned by the bank. Spirit alone cannot fight a war of attrition. Rossellini knew that psychological control had its limits, so he reinforced the cage with a lock that no amount of talent could pick. Absolute financial ruin. The romance of poverty wears off quickly when you are the one signing the checks. By 1953, the grand artistic experiment of Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini had devolved into a mundane, grinding panic about money. This financial desperation rarely makes it into the glossy biographies. Yet it was the essential mechanism of the trap. Control requires dependency, and usually the abuser makes the victim financially dependent on them. Rossellini flipped the script. He made himself dependent on her, but he framed it as a privilege. He allowed her to bankroll his genius. The dynamic was perverse. Ingrid Bergman had earned millions in Hollywood. She was thrifty, practically minded, a woman who darned her own socks and checked the price of milk. Rossellini was a chaotic aristocrat who viewed money as something that simply existed to be spent. He didn't earn it. He burned it. He had an insatiable appetite for speed and luxury. He bought Ferraris he couldn't afford. He entered the Mille Miglia, a 1,000-mile endurance race, risking his life and their livelihood for the thrill of the adrenaline. He renovated apartments. He bought rare books. And every time the bill came, he turned to Ingrid. She paid. She paid because she felt guilty for the scandal. She paid because she believed in his vision. But mostly she paid because he made her feel that withholding money was an act of betrayal. If she questioned a purchase, he would fly into a rage, accusing her of being a petty bourgeois shopkeeper, a woman who cared more about her bank balance than the history of cinema. He weaponized her thriftiness against her. He made financial responsibility look like a character flaw. This created a suffocating paradox. Ingrid was the sole breadwinner, yet she was forbidden from working. She was the sugar mama of the relationship, yet she had to ask permission to speak. She was funding the very cage that kept her confined. Every check she wrote to cover his racing debts was a check drawn against her own freedom. She was buying time for a man who was using that time to destroy her career. The tension reached a boiling point during the production of Journey to Italy, Viaggio in Italia. History now hails Journey to Italy as a masterpiece of modernism. To Ingrid Bergman, it wasn't a movie, it was a documentary of her own disintegration. The film tells the story of a British couple whose marriage falls apart while they travel through Naples. It was art, imitating life with cruel precision. Rossellini's direction on this film was not just unconventional, it was sadistic. He knew the script mirrored their crumbling relationship, and he forced her to live inside it without a map. He cast George Sanders, a cynical, polished Hollywood actor, as her husband. Sanders hated the production. He hated the lack of a script, the disorganization, the food, and Rossellini. He spent the entire shoot in a state of open misery. Rossellini used this. He manufactured this misery with surgical precision. Before filming began, Rossellini deliberately kept Ingrid and George Sanders apart. He forbade them from meeting, from rehearsing, from building any rapport. He wanted the awkwardness between them to be excruciatingly real. He forced Ingrid to stand in the crossfire, acting as the mediator between a co-star who despised her husband and a husband who was using her isolation as a texture for his film. And when the production ran out of money, as it always did, the humiliation deepened. When Ingrid hesitated to sign yet another check to cover his debts or his racing car habit, Rossellini would unleash his favorite insult. He would sneer and call her a petty bourgeois shopkeeper, accusing her of caring more about her bank account than high art. It was a masterstroke of financial gaslighting, stealing her money while making her feel shameful for wanting to keep it. He filmed Sanders's genuine irritation and Ingrid's genuine despair and called it acting. There is a scene in the film where Ingrid's character drives a car down a lonely road, surrounded by a landscape that feels hostile and ancient. The look on her face is not performance. It is the look of a woman who realizes she is completely alone in a foreign land. Rossellini stripped away every comfort. He forbade the crew from speaking to her between takes. He isolated her in her dressing room, which was often just a hot car parked on the side of a dusty road. He wanted her to feel the weight of the silence. He wanted her to break. When she begged him for direction, for just a hint of what her character was feeling, he gave her the most devastating instruction of all. Just walk. Just look. He was telling her that her thoughts didn't matter, only her image. He was capturing her soul, like a butterfly pinned to a board. He was stealing her grief and selling it as his art. The production was a nightmare of delays and strikes. The money ran out again. Ingrid had to dip into the last reserves of her savings to pay the crew so they wouldn't walk off the set. She was paying people to film her humiliation. When the film was finally released, the reception was the same old song. The critics yawned. The audiences stayed home. It was another flop. Another nail in the coffin of her bankability. The box office poison label was no longer a metaphor. It was a financial reality. Distributors stopped taking Rossellini's calls. They viewed the couple as toxic. The Italian press, which had once hailed Rossellini as a hero, turned on him. They called him a man who had ruined a goddess. They mocked his racing, his ego, and his string of failures. For Rossellini, this public rejection was intolerable. His narcissism could not handle the idea that he was the problem, so he found a scapegoat, Ingrid. He began to blame her for the failures. He told her that her acting was too heavy, too American. He told her that she had lost her spark. He told her that she was the reason the audience couldn't connect with his films. It was classic projection. He was the captain who had steered the ship into the rocks, but he was blaming the figurehead for the crash. The home life became a minefield. The apartment in Rome was filled with heavy, oppressive silence. Rossellini would disappear for days. Rumors of his infidelity were no longer rumors. They were headlines. He was seen with other women, younger women, women who looked at him with the adoration Ingrid had lost. When he came home, he was cold. He treated her not as a wife, but as a failed investment. He criticized her parenting. He criticized her Italian. He criticized the way she dressed. Ingrid absorbed it all. She had been conditioned to believe that she deserved this punishment. The guilt of leaving her daughter Pia in America was a wound that never healed, and Rossellini poked it constantly. He made her feel that this misery was her penance. But the most dangerous thing you can do to a practical woman is make her broke. The emotional abuse she could endure, she was used to suffering. But the financial ruin was a tangible threat to her children. The IRS in America was pursuing her for back taxes on income she hadn't earned in years. The Italian tax authorities were circling Rossellini. They were drowning. In 1955, the reality check arrived in the form of a ledger. Ingrid sat down and looked at the numbers. There was nothing left. The Ferrari had eaten the savings. The films had eaten the rest. They were facing total insolvency. The most famous couple in the world was living on credit, and the credit was gone. This was the crack in the armor. Rossellini's control relied on the illusion that he was a king and she was his queen in a private kingdom of art. But kings don't bounce checks. The poverty stripped away the glamour of his genius. She looked at him, and she didn't see a visionary anymore. She saw a deadbeat. She saw a man who would let his children go hungry rather than admit he needed to make a commercial movie. And then the letters started coming through. Not scripts, but demands. Demands for payment. And amidst those demands, a different kind of letter found its way to her. It wasn't a script from Hollywood, but a theater offer, a stage play, Tea and Sympathy in Paris. It was a small thing, a play, not a movie, not a betrayal of their cinema pact, just a way to make some quick money to pay the grocery bill. Rossellini initially scoffed at it. Theater was beneath him. It was for actors who couldn't make movies, but he looked at the bank account and he couldn't argue with the math. He grudgingly allowed it. He told her she could go to Paris, do the play, make the money, and come back. He viewed it as her doing a chore, like washing the dishes. He didn't realize he had just opened the cage door. Ingrid arrived in Paris in 1956. For the first time in 7 years, she was alone. There was no Roberto looming over her shoulder. There was no one translating her thoughts. There was no one telling her she was ugly or untalented. She walked into the theater. She smelled the dust of the stage. She felt the wooden floorboards under her feet. She met the director, a man who spoke to her with respect. He handed her a script, a real script, with lines, with a character arc. He asked her, "How do you see this role, Madame Bergman?" The question stunned her. How do I see it? No one had asked her that in a decade. She stepped onto the stage for the first rehearsal. She was terrified. She thought she had forgotten how to act. She thought the method Rossellini had forced on her, the non-acting, the clumsy improvisation, had ruined her technique. She opened her mouth to speak the lines, and the voice was there. the rich, resonant, powerful voice of Ingrid Bergman. It hadn't died. It had just been sleeping. As she rehearsed, something miraculous happened. She realized she knew what she was doing. She knew where to stand. She knew how to hold a prop. She knew how to listen. The skills she had honed in Hollywood, the skills Rossellini had mocked as mechanical tricks, were actually her salvation. They were the tools of a master craftsman. She wasn't a robot. She was a virtuoso who had been forced to play a broken instrument for 7 years. The play opened. It was a sensation. The French audiences didn't care about the Senate resolution or the illegitimate children. They saw a great actress giving a great performance. They stood and cheered. The applause washed over her like rain after a drought. It wasn't the polite applause of a film premiere. It was the visceral, immediate love of a live audience. Rossellini came to Paris to see the play. He sat in the audience. He watched his wife command the stage. He watched the crowd worship her, and he hated it. He saw the threat immediately. He saw that she was thriving without him. He saw that the sad, tired woman he had created was gone, replaced by a luminous, confident star. He went backstage after the show. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't hug her. He sulked. He complained about the lighting. He criticized the script. He tried to make her feel small again, but it didn't work. The spell was breaking. The gaslight was flickering. Ingrid looked at him and realized that his criticism wasn't about truth. It was about fear. He was terrified that she was realizing her own worth. And she was. Back in the hotel room, emboldened by the applause and the paycheck, Ingrid finally allowed herself to read the trade papers. She saw the news from Hollywood. The studio system was changing. They were desperate for big stars to fight off the threat of television. And there was a project at 20th Century Fox, a massive, big-budget historical drama about the lost princess of Russia, Anastasia. They were looking for a lead. They wanted a woman with a foreign accent, a woman with regal bearing, a woman who could play a tortured soul finding her identity. It was the role of a lifetime. It was a role that required acting, not just being. Ingrid sat in her hotel room in Paris. The phone sat on the bedside table. To pick it up and call Hollywood was an act of war. It meant declaring that Rossellini was not the only director in the world. It meant admitting that she wanted to be a movie star again. It meant betraying the artistic purity she had sacrificed everything. She looked at the phone. She thought about the debts. She thought about the empty look in Rossellini's eyes when he watched her succeed. She thought about the years of being told she was nothing. She picked up the phone. The conversation was short. She spoke to Spiros Skouras, the head of Fox. She asked if the role was still open. He said yes, but he hesitated. He asked the question that everyone in Hollywood wanted to ask. Will your husband let you come? Ingrid paused. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. She saw the lines on her face, the lines Rossellini had loved to film, because he thought they made her look weak. But now she saw them differently. They were battle scars. I am coming, she said, alone. She hung up. The embargo was breached, but the war was just beginning. Rossellini would not let his property go without a fight. He would use every weapon he had left, the children, the guilt, the Italian legal system, to stop her from getting on that plane to London. He would scream that she was selling her soul. But for the first time in 7 years, Ingrid Bergman realized that she wasn't selling her soul. She was buying it back. Yet buying back one's soul is never a peaceful transaction. The moment she put down that phone, the Cold War in the Rossellini household turned hot. The rebellion had been declared, and the tyrant was not going to let his subject leave without launching a final brutal assault on her conscience. The explosion that followed Ingrid's decision to accept Anastasia was not a simple marital argument. It was a collision of ideologies. When Rossellini found out, he didn't just get angry, he went nuclear. To him, this wasn't just his wife taking a job. It was high treason. It was the Pope watching a cardinal defect to atheism. He viewed Anastasia not as a movie, but as a personal insult to everything he had spent 7 years teaching her. He paced their apartment, screaming that she was selling out, that she was crawling back to the factory to make plastic kitsch for the Americans who had spat on her. He played his greatest hit, the guilt card. He asked how she could abandon their shared vision of pure cinema to play a fairy tale princess in a costume drama. But this time, the guilt didn't stick. The shield of manipulation had been cracked by the simple, brutal reality of their bank account. Ingrid stood her ground, not with defiance, but with the cold logic of survival. She pointed to the debts. She pointed to the children. She pointed to the fact that his pure cinema hadn't bought groceries in 6 months. She told him essentially that she was going to London to save them from the bankruptcy he had engineered. Rossellini fell silent. He was a narcissist, but he wasn't stupid. He knew they were broke. He hated Hollywood, but he needed its money. He let her go, but he did it with a sneer, predicting she would fail, predicting she would hate the artificiality of it all and come running back to his chaotic genius. But he didn't stop at predictions. He engaged in active psychological sabotage. In the final days before her departure, he systematically tried to dismantle her professional self-esteem. He told her that her Hollywood muscles had atrophied, that she had forgotten how to memorize lines, and that she was no longer capable of the technical precision the studios demanded. He planted a ticking time bomb in her psyche, the terrifying conviction that she was no longer a star, but a broken instrument that only he knew how to play. He wanted her to board that plane not with hope, but with a paralyzing fear that she was walking into a humiliation she couldn't survive. He was wrong. Ingrid arrived in London in 1956 to film Anastasia. The atmosphere on the set was a shock to her system. It was quiet. It was organized. There was a schedule. The director was Anatol Litvak, a Russian-born filmmaker who understood the Hollywood machine perfectly. He didn't scream. He didn't improvise. He treated Ingrid with a reverence that made her want to weep. The first day was a baptism of fire. She sat in the makeup chair. For 7 years, Rossellini had forbidden this. He had treated makeup like a lie. Now the studio's artists went to work. They didn't mask her. They restored her. They covered the sun damage from the Italian shoots. They highlighted the bone structure that was still the envy of the world. They fixed her hair. When Ingrid looked in the mirror, she didn't see the tired, browbeaten mother of 3 from Rome. She saw Ingrid Bergman. The ghost had returned to the machine. Then came the script. Litvak handed her the pages, actual pages, with dialogue typed out. She held it like a holy relic. She didn't have to guess what she was feeling. She didn't have to wander around a volcano waiting for instructions. It was all there. She had weapons again. But the trauma of the Rossellini years ran deep. As cameras rolled, panic set in. She froze. She was terrified that she had become too natural, that she had lost the technical precision required for a big studio production. She worried that her gestures were too small, her voice too real for the heightened drama of a royal mystery. She looked at Yul Brynner, her co-star, who was practically vibrating with intense theatrical charisma. She felt small. She felt like the amateur Rossellini had told her she was. Litvak saw the fear. He didn't mock her. He didn't yell. He simply guided her. He gave her space to find the character. And slowly, the muscle memory kicked in. The Hollywood robot turned out to be a master technician. She realized that the emotional rawness she had learned with Rossellini wasn't useless. She just had to channel it through the discipline she had learned at MGM. She fused the two styles. She gave a performance that was technically perfect, but emotionally devastating. She played a woman claiming to be a princess who might just be a mad woman, a role that mirrored her own identity crisis perfectly. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Rossellini was stewing. He was losing control, and he knew it. He tried to exert influence from a distance. He called her. He demanded updates. He planned to visit the set, a prospect that terrified the producers. They knew that if Rossellini walked onto that soundstage, he would try to take over. He would start shouting about lighting, criticizing the script, and destabilizing Ingrid. The studio practically set up a perimeter defense to keep him away, but the real threat wasn't his presence, it was his silence. As the filming progressed and the buzz around Anastasia began to build, Rossellini grew distant. He realized his prediction was failing. She wasn't hating it. She was thriving. The industry insiders who saw the dailies were whispering the word Oscar. The box office poison was about to become the cure. This should have been good news. A hit movie meant money. It meant their debts would be paid. But for a man with Rossellini's pathology, his wife's success was a personal failure. It proved that he wasn't the source of her talent. It proved that she could shine without his truth. It proved that the factory he despised could produce something beautiful with her, something he had failed to do for 7 years. Ingrid finished filming and returned to Rome, flushed with the adrenaline of a job well done. She expected, perhaps naively, that this would fix things. She had secured their survival. She had saved the family finances. She hoped that now, with the money pressure off, they could go back to being partners. She found a stranger waiting for her. Rossellini was cold, detached, and bitter. He didn't want to hear about London. He didn't want to hear about Litvak. He viewed her paycheck not as salvation but as blood money. The dynamic had shifted permanently. The balance of power, which had been tilted so heavily in his favor for so long, was leveling out. She was no longer the outcast dependent on his protection. She was Ingrid Bergman again, and Roberto Rossellini had no idea how to be married to Ingrid Bergman. He only knew how to be the master of a fallen woman. The tension in the apartment was suffocating. They were two people living in a mausoleum of dead dreams. Rossellini began to spend more time away, chasing a new project in India. He told her he needed to go there to find truth again, to escape the commercial rot of the West. It was a thinly veiled escape from her success. He was running away from the spotlight that was about to shine on her, a spotlight he was no longer invited to share. Then, the reviews for Anastasia started to trickle in. They were ecstatic. The critics who had savaged her for years were now writing love letters. They welcomed her back like a prodigal daughter. They praised her maturity, her depth, her suffering. The narrative was changing. She wasn't the Scarlet Woman anymore. She was the survivor. Ingrid waited for the premiere with a mix of hope and dread. She knew this was the turning point. If the public accepted her, she was free. If they rejected her again, she was trapped forever. She didn't know that the cage door was already open. The only question was whether she had the courage to walk through it and leave the man who held the key behind. Rossellini, sensing the end, packed his bags. He was leaving the scene of the crime before the verdict was read. He didn't realize that for Ingrid, losing him was no longer a threat. It was becoming a necessity. A narcissist who loses control does not negotiate. He escapes. Roberto Rossellini did not just leave for India. He fled. In 1957, as the promotional machine for Anastasia began to gear up, the Italian director realized he was facing a scenario his ego could not compute. If the film flopped, his wife was a failure, confirming his theory that Hollywood was a graveyard. If the film succeeded, his wife was a superstar, proving that she didn't need him. Both outcomes were intolerable, but the latter was a humiliation he couldn't witness up close. He needed a new frontier, a new chaotic environment where he could play the role of the visionary explorer, far away from the popping flashbulbs that were starting to illuminate Ingrid's face again. He accepted a commission from the Indian government to make a documentary. It was the perfect escape hatch. He told Ingrid he was going to capture the soul of a nation newly freed from colonialism. He spoke of Gandhi, of nonviolence, of spiritual truth. He packed his bags, leaving her in Rome to deal with the children, the creditors, and the terrifying prospect of her own comeback. He took the art with him, leaving her with the commerce. When he boarded the plane, the silence he left behind in the apartment was deafening. For 7 years, Ingrid's life had been a noisy, crowded room filled with Rossellini's voice, his shouting, his laughter, his philosophy, his commands. Now, there was just the hum of the refrigerator and the ringing of the telephone that he was no longer there to intercept. Ingrid was alone. But this time, the isolation felt different. It wasn't the isolation of a prisoner in solitary confinement. It was the isolation of a survivor standing in the wreckage of a storm that had finally passed. She waited for the release of Anastasia with the grim stoicism of a soldier waiting for a court-martial. She honestly didn't know if the world would hug her or spit on her. The wounds from the Senate denunciation and the hate mail were still fresh. She prepared herself for the worst. She told herself that if this failed, she would retire. She would focus on the children. She would disappear. But the world had changed while she was away. The 1950s had softened. The moral rigidness of the post-war years was cracking. When Anastasia hit the theaters in America, the reaction was not outrage. It was relief. The audience watched the screen and saw the familiar face age now, stripped of the baby fat of the 40s, etched with the lines of real suffering. They didn't see a whore. They saw a woman who had lived. The performance was undeniable. As the amnesiac refugee trying to recall if she was a Grand Duchess, Ingrid channeled every ounce of her own confusion and identity crisis. When her character screamed, "Who am I?" it wasn't acting. It was the primal scream of a woman who had spent 7 years trying to be Italian, trying to be neo-realist, trying to be Mrs. Rossellini, and forgetting who Ingrid Bergman was. The reviews were a landslide. The New York Times, which had been cool to her Italian work, welcomed her back with open arms. They called her superb, luminous, and triumphant. The box office exploded. The film made millions. In a matter of weeks, the box office poison label was ripped off and burned. The studio heads at Fox, who had been terrified of the Rossellini stigma, suddenly wanted to sign her for 3 more pictures. The embargo was lifted. The blockade was broken. But while Ingrid was conquering the West, Rossellini was busy conquering something else in the East. In India, the pattern repeated itself with a precision that was almost mechanical. Rossellini arrived in Mumbai not as a humble observer, but as a whirlwind. He charmed Prime Minister Nehru. He bullied the local crew. And inevitably, he found a muse. Her name was Sonali Dasgupta. She was 27 years old. She was beautiful, traditional, and, crucially, married to a local filmmaker. She had 2 small children. Rossellini didn't care. He saw what he wanted. He saw a new vessel for his truth. He saw a woman he could save from her mundane life, just as he had saved Ingrid from the boredom of Beverly Hills. The script was identical. He seduced her with talk of art and destiny. He overwhelmed her with his intensity. He ignored the cultural norms of India, just as he had ignored the puritanical norms of America. The affair became public, and the scandal was immediate. But this time, the dynamic was twisted. In 1949, Ingrid had been the villain, the saint who fell from grace. In 1957, with the news of the Indian affair hitting the papers, Ingrid was cast in a new humiliating role, the wronged wife. The press in Europe and America feasted on it. The man who had demanded absolute loyalty from the world's biggest star, the man who had forbidden her from working to protect his fragile ego, was now cheating on her with a screenwriter's wife in a Mumbai hotel. In Paris, Ingrid read the headlines with a cold clarity. The man who had demanded absolute loyalty was now repeating the exact same scandal with another woman. The noble pact of their isolation wasn't a fortress. It was just a waiting room until he found a new muse. By early 1957, the contrast between their fates was absolute. In Hollywood, the Academy Awards were approaching. The buzz was deafening. Ingrid was nominated for Best Actress. It was the ultimate apology. The industry was begging her to come back. They wanted to give her the gold statue to wash away the sins of the past. Ingrid didn't go. She couldn't. The trauma was still too close to the surface. She was terrified that if she walked onto that stage, someone would boo. She was terrified that the applause would feel fake. She stayed in Paris. According to Hollywood legend, she spent the night sitting in a bathtub, listening to the ceremony on a crackling radio, trying to wash away the anxiety of the verdict. In Los Angeles, Cary Grant, her old friend and co-star from Notorious, walked onto the stage to accept the award on her behalf. When her name was announced, the winner is Ingrid Bergman. The Shrine Auditorium didn't just clap, they erupted. It was a standing ovation that went on and on. It was a wall of sound that traveled across the Atlantic. Cary Grant held the statue and looked into the camera. "Dear Ingrid," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if you can hear me, congratulations." She heard him. In the bathtub in Paris, the tears finally came. They weren't tears of joy. They were tears of exhaustion. She had survived. She had survived the Senate, the hate mail, the debt, the bad movies, the shouting, the silence. She was back. But in India, Rossellini was digging a new hole. The Indian government was furious about the affair. Nehru was embarrassed. Rossellini's visa was revoked. He was effectively being kicked out of the country, dragging a new scandal behind him. He was a man without a country, while his wife was once again the queen of the world. When they finally spoke on the phone, the conversation was brief. There was no apology. Rossellini didn't do apologies. He ranted about the narrow-mindedness of the Indians. He complained about the heat. He asked about money. He didn't mention the Oscar. He didn't mention her victory. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge that he had lost the powersome struggle. Ingrid put the phone down and looked around the room. She was rich again. She was famous again. She was desired again. And she was married to a man who was currently creating a diplomatic incident in Asia with his mistress. The embargo was over, but the exit visa had a price. Rossellini returned to Europe, not to reconcile, but to negotiate. He brought Sonali with him. He was unapologetic. He expected Ingrid to understand. He expected her to accept this new reality, just as she had accepted everything else. He thought he still held the remote control to her life. He thought he could manipulate her with the children. He threatened to keep Roberto Jr., Isabella, and Isotta. He used the archaic Italian laws, which favored the father, to dangle custody over her head. He tried to gaslight her one last time, telling her that she was the one who had changed, that she had become Hollywood again, that she was no longer the pure soul he had loved. But the manipulation no longer worked. Ingrid looked at him and saw not a giant, but a desperate man drowning in his own chaos. She saw the strings. She filed for divorce. It wasn't a messy, screaming divorce. It was a surgical removal of a tumor. She gave him money. She paid off his debts one last time. She bought her freedom. She agreed to a custody arrangement that was painful but necessary, allowing the children to stay in Rome for school while she worked in Paris and London. She compromised on the details because she knew she had won the war. The last act of the embargo was the most pathetic. Rossellini tried to ban her from seeing the children if she got remarried. He tried to control her future from the grave of their marriage. But the world wasn't listening to him anymore. He was yesterday's news. He was the man who used to be married to Ingrid Bergman. A marriage to Rossellini ended not with a signature, but a siege. Exploiting Italian law, he kept their children in Rome, forcing Ingrid to pay for her freedom by becoming a visitor in their lives. She found peace with her new husband, Lars Schmidt, and her acting evolved. The saint was replaced by a woman of steel, her talent scarred but undeniable. History eventually hailed their films as masterpieces, but they were masterpieces built on human sacrifice. Rossellini tried to own the sun, boxing her light within his artistic ego. He failed. Her third Oscar victory and her enduring grace proved he could not make her bitter. Ultimately, cinema history remembers the films, but it remembers Ingrid Bergman as the miracle. She was not a victim, but the hero of a prison break. She proved a brutal truth. You can trap a wife, you can trap a fortune, but you can never trap a talent that was born to belong to the world. Ingrid Bergman reclaimed her narrative, and on this channel we strive to reclaim history. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please leave a like and subscribe to join our journey through the archives. The shadows of the Golden Age still hold many secrets waiting to be brought into the light. Which legend should we examine next? Tell us in the comments below. Until then, remember, the truth is often the most dramatic script of all.